It's time for our newspaper review, where Sally and I take a look at the stories making headlines around the world. Sarkozy and Merkel, back to the front line, back to the drawing board. That's the headline in Le Figaro, which says the German and French leaders are meeting today to discuss how they can grow Europe's battered economy.
The Financial Times reports on the $6 million bonus due to the man in charge of the Royal Bank of Scotland's embattled investment banking division, John Hurricane, which it says stands to contrast to the British government's vow to crack down on excessive executive pay.
Free trade features in China, in the China Daily, which says Japan and South Korea are expected to start talks with China to forge a new economic agreement in the first half of this year.
The International Herald Tribune takes a glimpse behind the scenes at the White House and says US First Lady Michelle Obama has evolved into a canny political player who exerts influence on her husband despite the objections of his advisors.
Surprise, surprise. He was too ill to attend the star-studded gala at the Cambridge University for his 70th birthday, but The Independent says the renowned scientist Stephen Hawking was still able to give a moving speech about his life, telling of how his father helped him cope with the devastating effects of motor neuron disease.
And a pretty penny in the South China Morning Post, which reports on a US penny from 1793 that's just fetched $1 million at auction. Nice if you can get hold of that.
How many Rolls Royces are in there?
You can get quite a few.
You can do the math. Sally and I are joined by Bundeep, Rangar, chairman of IndusView. Good morning and Happy New Year. This is the first of the year.
Absolutely. I think so.
Good to have you with us.
Too.
Le Figaro, and it's back to business. The holiday cheer is all over. Sarkozy and Merkel, the power couple of Europe, have to get this business sorted out. But I suppose it's going to be a bit more of a challenge, given the fact that Mr. Sarkozy has a big election on his hands as well.
Absolutely, and unemployment in France is the highest it's been in 12 years. He's got a lot of things to contend with. Absolutely right. And you're right, it's the reality setting in, right? So they had nice proclamations end of last year, kind of saved the euro, but you look at the euro currency slide in the last 2-3 weeks alone, it's at a 17 or 19-year low against the Japanese yen. That says
11-year low.
Against the Japanese yen, right?
Yeah.
So, and against the US dollar, it's down as well. So you've got a pretty challenging environment, and I guess a couple of litmus tests coming up as well. So you've got Belgium with its new budget out in a few days' time, and they're going to see if they can actually meet the new fiscal disciplinary requirements that the Eurozone is now putting in place. And you've got bond sales, not least of all by Italy. And that's the bond yields on that, i.e. the price that Italy has to pay to borrow, is going to be a key figure to watch as an indication of confidence of investors.
Now, this article says that they're going to try and focus on growth. How are they going to do that? I mean, how are they going to grow Eurozone economies, given the austerity measures they're pushing through, the belt tightening, etc., and the fact that European consumers are really holding back from spending?
And given the fact that a lot of growth is created by private enterprise, and this is a very state-led initiative at fiscal reform. So it's a very difficult challenge for these guys, because you want to free up the economy, encourage enterprise, and yet all the intervention by them is, like you said, austerity and cutting back. So it is going to be really difficult for them to create jobs and create growth. In the absence of certain more innovative things like more free trade, and people have talked about free trade, for example, between India and the EU, that could be a way to save.
As it's your first time with us this year, what's your outlook for the year? Are you an optimist, or are you one of the pessimists saying, you know, double dipper, disaster 2012?
I guess I'm an eternal optimist, so I'm not going to dip into a recessionary spiel here. But I do believe that Europe has done, for all said and done, the right thing. I think it's been sometimes too little and sometimes a little late, but they have moved in the right direction overall, with the exemption of course, the financial transaction tax, which I think is a bit of baloney, but that Tobin tax, as they call it. But keeping that aside, you know, the measures by the ECB, the various instruments they have, keeping a low interest policy, has by and large been okay. I think what they need to do is free up the economy more, lower taxes, which is going to be the most difficult one for them to do if they want to encourage growth. That's where the challenge lies for most governments.
His name is John Hurricane, and he's on the front page of the Financial Times today. I don't know if he'd be thrilled to see the reasons why, but he's on the front pages because of his pay, a £4 million bonus. And this comes at a time when the Prime Minister just finished speaking about the need to curb excesses as far as bonuses are concerned. I think it's going to be a difficult one, won't it? Because first you've got to define what is excessive, and some argue that this is something that really should be left in the hands of shareholders.
Well, yeah, the $6 million man here, right, with the $6 million bonus. I guess the real question here is it shareholders who dictate that, or is it the board? And in many ways, there's an executive board or non-executive board for a reason to control and implement things like remuneration, executive pay, performance-based bonuses, etc. When you put in the hand of shareholders, well, in some cases, shareholders are very transient, right? They may only be there for 2 months looking at a stock price move, but not really there for long-term value. And in the instance here, where 83% of RBS is owned by the taxpayer, it's even more challenging to put that in place.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because RBS is unusual in the sense that it is 83% owned by the UK taxpayer. That's the phrase that's thrown out there all the time. And yet, as a taxpayer, we don't feel we're seeing any benefit from this at all, do we? And yet, the man in charge of the investment banking division is doing rather well, thank you.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's really dangerous because in some ways you have to kind of let the company deal with its own issues, and shareholders have a limit in terms of how much they should get involved, because they will make tough decisions. At the same time as this bonus being paid out, there's job cuts as well at RBS for a few thousand people. Now, is that in the long-term interest of the company? Probably. In the short term, it'll seem upsetting to some people, and that's really where the issue lies, is you've got to let the board and the company's management get on with it without too much interference, and yet rein them against excesses, such as excessive pay. And that's where Cameron, I think, is coming from as well.
Moving on to the China Daily. While Europe tries to figure out its problems using austerity measures, Asia's going for free trade. As a matter of fact, we were just speaking to our correspondent Michael Bristow about the visit of the South Korean president, who's in China right now. They're talking about North Korea, obviously, but this is also one of the issues on the table. Perhaps a better strategy than strictly limiting yourself, straitjacketing yourself to austerity measures.
Well, as someone who grew up in Canada for a lot of my formative years, and looking at the benefits of the North American Free Trade Agreement, I think it's and like I alluded to earlier with Europe, opening up the corridors of trade certainly helps all parties. And it's also, in many ways, a great peace-building initiative. And if you look at that in the Middle East, you may have a different situation today. In the Far East, now you've got the world's number 2 and number 3 economies, and also the number 2 and 3 holders of foreign exchange reserves in the form of China and Japan. So this is actually a really healthy step. And if you stretch it out further, you look at not only South Korea, but over time that could include certain other countries in that periphery, not least of all, down the line, places like North Korea that need to be reined in some ways into a fully fledged market economy. So it's very encouraging. The question is how far they can go. What we do know is between China and Japan, trade last year went up 23%, and that's in the tune of about $340 billion. That's pretty extensive, and I think this is just recognizing reality and lowering the barriers of trade, which I think overall is very healthy.
Tell us, Bundeep, what you make of the story in the International Herald Tribune about Michelle Obama and her influence, that she is much more involved and opinionated than perhaps Barack Obama's team would like her to be. There's always these rumors, isn't there, about, the partner of political leaders and their influence, isn't there?
Well, it's clear that Barack Obama's success has a lot to do with her over the years. They have a very intimate, very understanding, and some very ambitious agenda. And in the past 2 years, the way this book, the Obamas, has chronicled some of the, not only the overt gestures, but some of the more subtle gestures in meetings to give a good flavor of what exactly has gone on behind the scenes. And the contention, like you said, between the advisors, who Michelle Obama thought were not strategic enough, and in some way she blamed the loss of the majority in the houses there by the Democrats and losing seating power to the Republicans, in some ways as listening too much to the advisors and not paying enough attention to the troops on the ground. And that, of course, has cost the U.S. and the Democratic Party a lot of grief over the past year, including the S&P downgrade and then certain thawing of issues such as the health care plan that he's putting forward. So I think that her strength lies in the fact that she's been one step behind, but I think it's also, there's this reference to Guam as her unit within the White House as being vocal but not influential.
Well, these controversies will always continue. Perhaps we could just end with a nod to a milestone, a man who is loved and admired, and it's an incredible story. Stephen Hawking speaking about how his father came to, he supported him when the doctor diagnosed him with his illness, and as he says, he washed his hands of me, referring to the doctor.
Yeah, Lou Gehrig's disease, what a crazy and violent disease. But to someone, if there's a will, there's a way. Here's testimony to that. He survived
determination
for 40 years beyond people thought he would live for, and he's contributed so much to science. It's a great inspiration for everybody.
Absolutely. Great inspiration to start the year. And from you as well, Bundeep. Thank you very much for coming in. And looks like that's all we have time for right now. There'll be more news in a few minutes. And in business...
Yes, and in business, there's plenty more ahead. Stay with us here on the BBC as we keep you up to date with all the latest stories, including that key meeting today again between Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy. Thanks for watching.